All right, John, you're up first.
All right. Yeah, we just have these two items. I assume mine will be short, and then Mitch's will be, or Keith's will be longer. So if anyone else wants to put something on, put it on. Otherwise, we'll probably spend the whole time on the Keith's. So I just have this one small issue. I don't even really have anything to share, so I won't share my screen. But it's basically the ability to add more control over on how you enroll something into the mesh. Today, we just have an opt-in label. We actually used to have more options. We had a full match expression thing in mesh config. And even in sidecars, we have more options as well. I don't remember the full sidecar API surface, but at the very least, we have a mode where everything is in the mesh by default and you opt out. So I think there's kind of those two use cases. One is that I want to make things opt out of ambient mesh instead of opt in. This is kind of the case where I'm running a platform where I've decided I want to run ztunnel everywhere. That was kind of how we built ztunnel, was specifically to meet that use case. So people run other CNIs, Exilium, Calico, etc. For example, those don't even really have an opt out at all. There's maybe a use case if I want very bespoke control over some complex things like my own labels or like some whatever. I don't have a strong feel on what the motivations there are and how much we need to support that. And then finally, I would say there's a potential case that I want to enforce all the pods are in the mesh from like a security standpoint, which would be kind of a precursor to something like egress authorization policy. Again, like I don't know that we're there yet at this point. That's not my primary use case here. My primary use case is really just the opt-out mode. But it would be something that if we were to future-proof this, so that we could support that in the future, it would be nice, right? And what that really requires is just that the admin controls who is in the mesh, not the users. Yeah, go ahead, Costin, I think.
Yeah, the proxyless gRPC and, I have a sidecar ztunnel or native implementation. It's also an interesting case for this. Where it's not really opt-out, it's still using ambient, but it's implemented in different way.
So do they want to, what do they want to do? Just say use HMOD when you're connecting to me, or do they want to do some more than that?
Yeah, I mean it's implementing the same protocol, but natively.
I guess I get that's a use case. What do we need? Like, is there anything that we need that we don't have?
Nothing special. It's the same use case as you said. Basically, you
okay.
not use ztunnel from the node, but also don't mark it as not supporting ztunnel. So don't treat it as.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I guess I kind of had two things I wanted to get out of this. One is, do people think this is useful or not useful? And then we can backthread the API, or we can do that in an API PR. I don't have a strong preference.
I actually remember we had this configurable initially, like 3 years ago, maybe now.
Yeah, we did. The reason we removed it was because we, when we were in upstreaming the prototype, this was the only API, or the only thing in the API repo, and we wanted to remove any potential barriers to getting it approved. That was really the main thing. We weren't sure that it was needed. I think since then, it's actually become probably easier to implement as well, because back then it was a little murkier on how you enrolled something in the mesh. Now it's a lot more clear that the CNI declares whether something is in the mesh and the user intent is separated from that. Like whether it actually actuated the mesh enablement. So I think that probably makes it a little bit simpler.
To make it a bit more complicated, hopefully we'll not repeat the mistakes we did with the sidecar opt-in opt-out, and take into account that the admin may have to first choice. I mean, to allow or not to allow individual pods to opt out, and then if we allow pod to opt out, then it will be some label on the pod. But with sidecars, kind of it was free for all. I mean, you just add the label, and suddenly you don't have any security or anything enforced.
Yeah, I think we'd probably could do something like a namespace and pod label match expression and mesh config, That way, like if you want the case of just opt out, then you would say something like data plane mode not in disabled. And if you don't want to even allow that, you would just say everything. Or you could even have like a list of namespaces that are the admin allowed to opt out, like.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, I mean, to make it more complicated, we need to this time to take into account the proper persona who has, who should be able to opt out and to allow opt out and this stuff, which we kind of didn't do for sidecars.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So it's not as simple. It shouldn't be as simple as just putting a label like we had.
Yeah, that's why I was saying like match expressions can do some more complex stuff, so you can express really whatever you need. And we already used that with discovery selector, so it would be quite similar there.
So I like the idea of having a way to install Istio such that it's opt out. I assume that this is a non-default install time parameter. I'm a little bit confused about Costin's statement that you can't opt out with a label.
No, so the idea is, okay, so there's a few different ways we can implement this. The simplest way is like a Boolean, where it's like enable everything in mesh by default. What Costin's saying, and I agree, is that that's only enough to solve one use case, but not enough to solve some use cases that are important. Because if you do that, then it means anyone can opt out of the mesh, and maybe you have some compliance rules that everyone must be in the mesh, or maybe in the future we want to add egress policies, which we very much want them to be in the mesh, or things like that. So the other use case is that only the admin should be able to control it. So what doing something like a match expression would allow is that you can express that or any other constraints you have, and you can say like everyone except for Cube System is in the mesh as an admin, or maybe you add in the foobar app team as well because they got an exception with our admin, things like that. Right?
I'm fine with the flexibility. I do think we should keep in mind that for policy, there are things like Gatekeeper out there that are really much better at enforcing fine-grained who can opt out versus who cannot opt out, etc. I don't want to completely replace them, but if we can have a simple match expression that is controlled by the administrator such that they can say there's no such thing as opt out, or you opt out with this label, or it's opt in, I'm fine with that sort of flexibility.
But Gatekeeper, I mean, how many people use it? Do we have documentation how to use it? It's complicated. I agree it's a good tool, but I don't know. If we should have at least a simple thing like forced in at least, yeah.
Yeah, basic controls with the knowledge that if you want more detailed policy, there's policy engines out there for enforcing these policy.
I agree. So not too simple, not too complicated.
Okay. Anyone? It sounds like everyone's at least directionally in line with this. Obviously, the issues doesn't have any details. We need to work out where it goes, how it works. I recall there was some complexity with plumbing through mesh config to CNI, so we'll need to figure out how that works. But is there any high-level directional objections, or should we kind of scope this out and start working towards this?
If we can put it in other place than mesh config, it will be even better. But yeah.
Yeah, if it's possible, we could put it. But yeah, I mean, we need to figure that out. So. All right. I will mark that as no one had directional concerns, but there's a lot of details to figure out. Only thing left on the agenda is multi-network. Keith or whoever is, or Mitch or anyone, do you want to present this while you talk through it?
Yeah, I can present. I'll spin the wheel on my network connectivity. It's been halfway decent today, but no, my luck, I just jinxed it. Okay. Trying to find the right right window. Here we go. Here we go. All right, so I went through another pass on this last week / today to try and knock out the changes we discussed. Now, so as a heads up, I have to leave in 15 minutes for something else. But the thing I want to start with discussing is the API. So I try to get consensus on MCS versus topology. I had thought I had put this in alternatives, but I must have not. Basically, the last week I had traffic distribution here as the API for this. I reverted that for a couple of reasons. The main one being that after talking with John and looking into the API, traffic distribution doesn't actually give us endpoint population. So traffic distribution helps to limit or to, as a heuristic, to help pick or weigh which endpoints get selected, but it does not populate net new endpoints as an API. And so since the endpoint population is one of the main needs for multi-cluster, it's not going to be altogether sufficient. So I added the multi-cluster service pieces back, and then put a paragraph in here about how we can combine MCS with traffic distribution. And in fact, I believe Mike had, see here,
Yep.
Mike's working on some stuff. And yeah, can you talk about some of the stuff you've been working on in SIG multi-cluster, potentially to add traffic distribution? You mentioned there's a couple of discussions, but not sure how far along that is.
Yeah, there was just a very brief discussion at the end of the last SIG multi-cluster meeting about how traffic distribution might be applicable to multi-cluster services in that API. And it's basically for the persona of the service owner, service exporter. If a traffic distribution field was configured on the exported service, then when addressing that, when a consumer of that service is addressing it through the .clusterset.local API in a different server, if that policy is configured, it could imply that they should prefer local endpoints if available. So if you're in a kind of like hub cluster model where you're exporting it from your exporting service from 3 clusters in a cluster set, and it's also like available on your local one, you might prefer your local endpoints unless they're exhausted or something like that. But it would not prevent it if you're only exporting it from one in a cluster set where it's only available in that remote one and it's through the service import. It would still like route to that. It's basically a service owner exporter saying prefer using your local endpoint if it's available. But that was it. I don't think it would actually be any like API change or addition to service export CRD or anything like that. It's more of just like we could write that this is a behavior that should be applicable.
Cool. So that's sort of where my brain is on MCS versus traffic distribution. I'm not aware of any other standard API for input population. And there has been a little bit of renewed headwind in the SIG multi-cluster MCS API. I think Cilium notably is working to get their MCS implementation launched in their next release in February. Since I last checked it, the MCS API, there is now a core DNS plugin for multi-cluster for doing cluster set.local, which is I think is very interesting. So I feel like it's a pretty good spot for us as a project to land in. There's also opportunity for us to drive things to completion if we feel that it's needed as we come across the implementation. So just want to take a pause there on the API piece for MCS. Any concerns or questions on this point for endpoint population?
Yeah, I'm just not understanding either the developer facing details or the user facing details. Like, how does the user interface with it, and what objects exist where?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's I was working on a diagram right before this and didn't get a chance to finish it. But basically, as part of the proposal, Istio would be an MCS controller. So in theory, if you turn on auto exporting, the user wouldn't have to create any exports or imports. It would be completely controller driven. And however, we have the flexibility to turn that controller off, and the user could use Karmada, Submariner, Google, or Azure, what have you, as a drop-in replacement for basic endpoint functionality and routing. Yeah, that's sort of my answer there.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Finish up, Johnny.
Okay. Yeah. So say I have auto export on. As a user, I call the service name and it goes local. I call the cluster set name and it goes across all the clusters. And I don't need to export or import anything because it all happens automatically.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of this for several reasons. I mean, supporting MCS as first-class API, which may be provided and implemented already by the platform, that's wonderful. We had support, incipient support for MCS. We need to finish it up, test it, make it sure it works. Absolutely great. MCS is good, but we should not implement MCS ourselves, but let the platform support it, because again, otherwise we have conflict with the platform, and we open a can of worms, a lot of problems. DNS is not a problem because any platform supporting MCS will have cluster set local implemented, and again, we don't want to fight with them, with the platform. Now, the interesting case is when users bring their own domain names and they have their own DNS and they have their own infrastructure in place and they have example.corp or .prod.internal and they have their own domains, not cluster set.local, which is really what Istio used to provide. And that's where we have the infrastructure in place and we can actually support this properly, either with the DNS interception or with bring your own DNS if they have their own DNS infrastructure. So, and that doesn't require a lot of, doesn't require control. It's just a matter of, having the name exposed with service entry or the equivalent. We can replace it with something better if we don't want to support anymore. But it will provide the user's ability to, first of all, have fine-grained control, which is not something MCS provides, because it's also like Istio. It's everything, everyone can use it, no controls, no visibility. If you have 20 clusters and a lot of services, everyone will get shitload of configurations, and we go back to scalability problems and security problems.
So if I can jump in just right quick, I think one thing I clarify is that one, Istio has to come with something out of the box for multi-cluster. Like I don't think, and then that's part of the conceit of this design is that by like first class, we want to allow people to use their existing infrastructure, their existing platform for MCS. But for users who don't have that, or they're running bare metal or what have you, like Istio has to come with something. Otherwise, can you truly say that we support it? Like we support. Without a controller built in, we support integration, but we wouldn't support multi-cluster on our own. Secondly, when it comes to the auto export specifically, that's an optimization. Like that is also a knob that can be turned off. If you ideally, like for larger customers or people using MCS in the way it was designed, like yes, on a service, each service owner is deciding whether or not they want to export their service. The goal here is to try to meet, the reason why this actually comes across as a bit complex is because we're trying to meet two use cases, or three, a matrix of use cases, where there are those users who are using just Istio, they know Istio, they're trying to do multi-cluster and ambient with Istio, and they need a batteries included experience for that. That batteries included experience could be auto export. We could potentially allow them to hijack cluster.local. We could sort of have this, again, very Istio-like experience for people who are familiar with that. But at the same time, we very much want to support the scenario where I have a platform. I have a cloud provider who does MCS for me. I want to use that as a first-class primitive, and therefore I want to use clusterset.local. I want each one of my service owners to export their services and then have the import created by the controller. The goal is to also support that, to try to support kind of the whole spectrum of experiences by making these sort of sub-controllers and sort of composing everything. Hopefully that helps clarify sort of what the idea is.
Yeah, but so Kit, I have absolutely fine. If the platform provides MCS, we should support it, and I think we kind of support it already. It's not I don't think it's really broken, unless maybe there's some configuration nodes, but I think it was working. What I'm saying is there are plenty of projects implementing MCS. Do we really want to duplicate them and to start implementing our own just because in case user doesn't want to install another one, they use our MCS implementation? Let them pick one of the 5 different implementations of MCS, and if an MCS is provided, we use it. But out of box, if you install Istio, we should be able to support bring your own names with service entry, which we had for quite a while, and gives user far more flexibility than cluster.set.local. They can use real DNS names. They can use .internal, which is a real, the official names that you should use for internal names instead of local. And it's consistent with what we had, and it's far more powerful than I'm not saying we should not use cluster.local if they choose to, but we should preserve the old experience where you can use your own prod names that you have without Istio, or without Kubernetes, outside of Kubernetes. I don't know. That's my opinion. I would rather use an existing MCS implementations than having Istio start to implement their own MCS because, maybe user doesn't have an MCS implementation, doesn't want to use one of them, and they want to use ours.
Go ahead, Mike.
So yeah, I definitely hear that concern, Costin. I think one of the challenges with the existing MCS implementations is that there is no reference. There's no like small contained reference implementation for it. Carmata is a fairly large project. Obviously, Google's implementation is cloud provider specific. Same with other options such as AWS's. One thing that I've discussed a little bit with Keith and Mitch as a potential option is rather than baking this into STOD and trying to solve the kind of like multi-primary and like having that like in a cluster set of 3 clusters, you have some, if you bake it into STOD and you have 3 separate control planes, you need to have some sort of coordination between them, potentially some leader election, something like that. A possible alternative would be a small standalone MCS implementation. This could be STO specific. This could be something that becomes a reference implementation. Is that something that is attractive to you at all? And it's also something that could be completely optional.
That would be my first preference anyway. It's having we have too much complexity. STOD, we need to admit that STOD is extremely complicated, has a lot of pieces, and it's not very modular. You cannot reuse it. What you suggested will be super useful for everyone who doesn't use Istio, doesn't want to use Istio, but they want to use MCS. So they will take this piece, use it with whatever they want, and get an MCS that is good enough. And if they want to add Istio later, wonderful. If they don't want to use Istio later, it's also fine. That would be great, and it reduces the pressure on Istio-D, which is exploding. I mean, I don't know if anyone can claim that Istio-D is the cleanest piece of code at this point.
I've got to run in a second, but Louis, go ahead. I'll stick around as long as I can.
I largely agree with Costin said, and I think the compromise, Mike, that you suggest is probably practical. I do want to be clear, like separating the naming semantic of .clusterset.local from the implementation of MCS. Right? There's no reason why Istio can't provide .clusterset.local if that's the DNS suffix people want to use to address the services that are in a multi-cluster mesh. Right, like that's, so what I'd like to see us do is maybe separate a design for naming control and mapping a naming control onto Istio multi-cluster network and multi-network semantics from something like MCS, which is both picking one name standard and an implementation detail of how that naming standard is achieved, right, as infrastructure, right? It's almost like MCS is two things. And they really should be split or made much clearer, right? That those two things are actually distinct. Yep. And so I think it would be good to start working on a naming, a generic naming API, or just a multi-cluster, multi-network naming API that can subsume that cluster set.local semantic, as well as other potential semantics that people might prefer. An example, as Costin pointed out, right, like Kubernetes naming semantics are okay, but they're not great. For those, Mike, you worked at Console at HashiCorp, right?
Yep.
Console, if I remember rightly, it completely dictated a DNS naming structure for services based on topology. Right, you could have data. I think it was like data center and stuff like that. Right, like it was this really structured DNS name, and you could subquery it. Right.
Yes.
For topology.
Mm-hmm.
There are absolutely going to be people who want that. Right. There's plenty of prior art for creating naming structures. The only thing that we have, and that I'd like to see us persist with, is the namespace sameness concept in general, right? Which is service name and namespace, and everything that surrounds that, right, is query language or boilerplate.
Yeah. So Louis, when I said allow user to use any namespace they want, any domains they want, that includes cluster set local. So if they want to use cluster set local, wonderful. It's the name as any others that we support. Only exceptions that they should not be allowed to use is cluster local, because that has semantic defined by Kubernetes to be cluster local. So anything except cluster local is fair game. Google.com, if you want to use it, well, probably will not work very well, but you can. It's not, we cannot restrict it. I don't think we should be in the business of defining, you must use cluster set local. That's really namespace, having the second component after the name be namespace. I agree. That was something we should strongly recommend. I don't think we have alternatives to preserve sameness in namespace, and it's not a huge problem, I think.
Yeah, I mean, a cluster set is a topology label. So yeah, I completely agree, Costin.
Which MCS has no business. I mean, there is no reason for MCS to say you must use cluster set local or else.
Right. So we can certainly support cluster set.local and be quote unquote conformant with MCS, but we can also make that a configurable domain name to trigger all the same things. Now that might get somewhat tricky with the overlap with like trust domains, for example. But if we implement it correctly, it should be completely orthogonal, right? The way your policy is written shouldn't necessarily, and what's on your certificate shouldn't be impacted by what DNS name you use to call the services. So I think we're in alignment there that cluster set.local needs to just be an implementation detail, and really any DNS suffix should suffice in DNS proxy to trigger the multi-cluster routing. Does that capture the consensus?
Yeah, let's prototype an API specification for it, and we can iterate.
Cool. All right. This is where I have to go. Mike or Mitch, if you'd like to continue sharing, that's totally fine with me. Other things to, and I guess this is generally a call to TOC to look over the new version of the doc. Other things to look into are specifics around waypoint addressing. I added a section for API additions, and after this conversation, I'll add a bullet point for DNS suffix cluster as an alternative to cluster set.local. And then API scenarios for what the traffic path looks like. So yeah, I'll check
And
that.
keeping MCS implementation out, and keeping MCS implementation as a separate sub-project or component, independent of HTOD.
Oh, yes, I will. I can't add that now, but I will add that when I
Okay.
get back, or somebody else can.
Go.
Feel free to add it into the doc, Costin, and I'll get it integrated. Thanks, folks.
So on the DNS front, one curiosity I have is do we want to become a first-class Kubernetes DNS controller? It seems like I can imagine some very small defaults that we can add, you know, like using mesh config or something along those lines of what the default search additions are going to be, how we can redirect pods from cluster local to some other multi-cluster like domain, etc. But how detailed and nuanced do we want to get in that? It seems like it could be a long road that we could start pulling on that yarn and go quite a ways.
I think for a production user, I would want to be able to use my own DNS. That should be a must. I mean, if you cannot use a real DNS and you are forced to use Istio DNS, we are doing it wrong. We already have a DNS interceptor, which is kind of DNS server because we can control the resolution, and it's perfectly fine for people who do not have a real DNS to use it. I don't have a problem with keeping what we have, but we should optimize for production, not for demos and local development. That's.
So I have a question on that front, right? There's obviously a huge distinction to be made between Kubernetes services and services that are directly managed by the mesh and services, right, which are part of the external universe. Right, we already...
Is there a distinction? I don't know.
Yeah, right, we already allocate names and IPs, right? Now we could be a little less aggressive about allocating names, but we just discussed allocating names, right? And controlling allocation of names. And MCS does exactly that. And Istio is like pretty capable of allocating names and IPs for services that it manages.
I don't have a problem with that, but again, there's a difference between managing DNS, I mean, creating entry in a DNS server with the names you choose and with IP addresses you want, and maybe TXT record and SRV record and key records and whatever. Managing DNS is one thing, but re-implementing and creating your own DNS server and creating a fully conformal DNS server just because you want to allocate some names, it's a bit too much. I mean, the DNS servers are, super complicated. They have all kind of 30 years of CVEs and exploits and DOSs and other things that they are dealing with, which we can only superficially replicate. So that's why I prefer to use a real DNS server whenever possible. That's really my concern here.
Well, I mean, so yes and no, Costin, right? Like public internet DNS servers have had to deal with all manner of things that just aren't the case inside Kubernetes or inside the Istio naming scheme, right?
Not in multi-network. Remember even in the current implementation of Istio for multi-network is based on creating something that is accessible on the internet. In some cases, you have zero trust. That was the definition of zero trust. You can have clusters that use public internet in some cases and may expose some things to public internet. And also, do you trust anything in the local network to not be malicious and bring down your DNS server or accidentally bring down your DNS server? Or I don't know. It's even more likely someone will try to exploit it and do IP over DNS to exfiltrate data and bring down your DNS server.
Right, but our authentication mechanisms are entirely orthogonal, right, to DNS nowadays, generally speaking.
Not for DNS. For DNS, we don't do any authentication. It's just UDP.
No. But right, but other than the secure naming concern, right, we authenticate end to end, which is not something the public internet does or has done for the last 20 years.
We authenticate after DNS is resolved. So basically, if DNS is compromised, we are compromised. We are as vulnerable as DNS is, because secure naming happens after we get the IP address, and based on the IP address written by DNS. So DNS is a critical piece of infrastructure for Istio. That's not
right, but the attack requires more than one exploit, right?
only one DNS. If you exploit DNS, Istio security is gone. That's all you need to do. If you take over DNS and you can inject an IP address, we are done.
You also need to impersonate a workload, right? That can get a spiffy identity.
No, we just need to be able to deploy a workload, which anyone in the mesh, you just create a pod. Anyone can create a pod with your own identity, and then if you set the IP address of the pod, Istio will say, "Oh, that's the IP address. Okay, you have a certificate which anyone gets for free." Anyway, I don't want to get into too much details. I think we discussed it in the past, and I think we agreed in the past. So I don't want to reopen it. But I don't think we disagree with anything, Louis. I mean, it's about supporting a proper DNS if the user chooses to, and our own DNS interception if they don't have one. That's
so. More practically, can any modern enterprise DNS handle the rate of change that we currently handle?
Easily. I mean, they handle the rate of change of public internet. I mean,
well, those are not enterprise DNSs.
Yeah, and those are not changing. Like, pod lifecycle is much shorter than the lifecycle of a public IP address and domain name.
I think you are underestimating enterprise DNS servers greatly. I mean,
well, I've seen core DNS.
Core DNS is not an enterprise DNS. Core DNS is not enterprise DNS. I'm talking about Google Cloud DNS, Microsoft DNS, Cloudflare DNS, all the DNS servers that run, zones. I mean, everything that runs .com and
yeah, those are not enterprise DNSs, Costin, in the sense that enterprises like to run their own internal DNS servers, right? If they're trying to partition, right? They are not horizontally scaled the way like Cloudflare or Google's or Microsoft's would be. They're not even close to that. Their read-write modify cycles are slow. Like core DNS is actually good by enterprise DNS standards.
Okay, if they don't have, I mean, like with MCS implementation, I have no problem if we package Power DNS or one of the enterprise DNSs, because most enterprises actually use one of the 3 or 4 main implementations. And the implementation I'm talking about are used in the public zones. I mean, there is one used in Europe, there are a bunch of implementation. Any of the implementations that runs a zone is more than enough, and I don't have a problem if we package it. We can deploy it. It's perfectly fine if the user doesn't have one. Just don't implement your own. I mean, it's...
Well, okay. How about this? Because we need proof, Austin, right? And the only comparison point we have right now is core DNS, right? Where we've actually run comparisons or seen production issues.
Yeah, core DNS is not really it's a toy. It's something designed to run a small network. It's not an enterprise DNS. I don't agree that it's a right. So I'm familiar with Google DNS. I'm pretty sure Microsoft has a very good DNS for their customers. And on-prem, yeah.
So there are SaaS DNSs, right, which we can't just abide by those. And then so we have to take on premise as a first-class citizen. What would you suggest?
Bind, Power DNS, any of them are probably good enough. Bind is not bad. It's if it's backed by a database.
Okay, I think you need to write a concrete proposal about
Okay.
what it would take to productionize one of those things, and to have Istio and/or Kubernetes populated at scale.
So productionize it versus implement a new DNS server and productionize it.
Well, we've already implemented one.
We didn't implement. We implemented a toy like core DNS. I mean, it's not really a DNS server. It's just supporting 1% of what DNS does. It's
I know. Like that's the point. The earlier point was we only need to support 1% of what DNS actually does. So actually,
Yeah.
how about this? Can we write the functional requirements on the DNS?
So do you think secure DNS is, as a security product that has a critical dependency on DNS security, do you think secure DNS is a valid requirement for DNS implementation? I mean, signed records, DNS SIG? Do you think DNS over TLS or doc?
I would certainly favor DNS over TLS, right? So we couldn't man in the middle as a basic starting point.
Yeah, but
Very basic.
DNS SIG is a real standard. I mean, DNS SIG
Yeah,
is
I know. Yeah, I agree.
So is it acceptable to run Istio without DNS SIG and call it secure when compromising DNS is a compromise of Istio? I don't know. It's a choice.
I would certainly very likely entertain a proposal which said DNS SIG is a requirement and here's why. I think that's fair.
So kind of stepping back from the discussion a little bit, I don't think Keith or I or Mike have any strong passion about DNS. There's some very, I would say, insignificant requirements where multi-cluster needs some degree of DNS support. I wonder if it would be possible to resolve your larger concerns around DNS orthogonally to this particular proposal.
Yeah, probably so. I mean, the only requirement I want to put here is that we should be able to support a proper DNS. I don't disagree with Louis. I mean, if we can extend our DNS or use our DNS, I'm not against it. I'm just saying that it should be an option to use cloud DNS provided by any of the big clouds.
Yeah, you can always turn off DNS proxying when installing.
Not quite, because in Istio, if there are a lot of functionality in Istio that now it's tied to our DNS interception. So as a service entry, it kind of leaked in.
Yeah, the dynamic VIP allocation is now kind of like a hard requirement.
Yes,
Okay, I see what you mean.
and unless
You
you have
could identify
to-
those spots, yeah.
So you can use an enterprise DNS or like fully delegate or partially delegate.
Yep.
Right. Or never delegate. Right. Those are the kind of three options. We already partially delegate. Right. If we don't know a name, we delegate.
Yeah.
I can't think. Just thinking back to user requirements or user conversations, I've never heard a user require fully delegating.
Unless they use DNSSEC, in which case they should fully delegate because our resolver is not secure.
Right, but core DNS is also not secure, and node local DNS in Kubernetes is also not secure.
Yeah.
So surely they would have heard those requirements too, right?
I guess that feels less to me like a case that we should expect to hear from a user, and more of a case of like, if a vendor wants to offer a managed Istio platform with a managed integrated DNS offering, that is one of their platform requirements. Like that user story kind of makes sense to me more so than expecting an Istio end user to come asking for this.
Well, an Istio user probably doesn't know they need to ask for a secure DNS because we don't
Exactly.
document really that DNS is critical. We don't document that our DNS is not secure. We don't document that, service entries override DNS and create all the problems. It's kind of, we know it,
Well,
but
I mean, to
pretend
be
it
fair,
doesn't exist.
Justin, like Istio is widely enough used today that I figure at least one of these customers' internal security audits would have found this and complained if it was material.
And it's scary that they didn't, no? Don't you think? I
There are
mean,
many scary things in the world. This is
I know.
probably lower on my
anyway,
list.
let's
of
move on.
scary
I don't
things.
want to derail this with DNS.
Okay.
Okay, so aside from DNS giving us kind of the ability to represent these services as well as to sort of modify the default resolution order of the domains, do we have comments or concerns on the API? Does it feel like we've given a complete explanation here?
Yeah, my concern is that MCS doesn't actually provide the data that we need to call another cluster. I also have concerns that the UX is backwards, but there's also like one problem you have to solve and the other you maybe should solve. Specifically, like in MCS today, we don't care about service import. We just go and read the pods from the other cluster because we need information from the pods. At the very least, we need the service accounts, but there's some other stuff too. I'd have to go look through the code to see what we pull from there. The other thing from a UX standpoint, I think MCS is backwards. The service producer should really be the one controlling the scope of their service. Like I don't call borexcel1.google.com, right? I call google.com and they tell me where that goes. Maybe they have the ability to give me multiple domain names and let me choose, but at least in the common case, like just think about if I have like a service and I have it in one cluster. Now I'm deciding, oh, I actually need HA. I need to go to 2 clusters. Like I export my service. I go tell every consumer of my service in the world to update to the cluster set IP. And then, well, I hope I never go back down to one cluster and remove the cluster set IP. Otherwise, they're all stuck on that one as well, right? It's not really a consumer decision. And the reason that MCS works this way, I think, is because it was designed by people that made ingress things, not service mesh things, where the person writing a route picks which one to go to, and the person writing the route is the service producer. So it doesn't actually matter.
So I think that's resolved, or at least we intended to resolve that problem, because you're right. We did not want to have an environment where the choice of to multi-cluster or not is purely a consumer-driven question. So the way that you would resolve that as a producer is by modifying the DNS search priorities. So you would say, like in this cluster, when I resolve service foo, instead of resolving this foo.cluster.local, resolve to foo.clusterset.local. You can do that with a CNAME or a AAA or quadruple A record. And those would be done via the persona of the producer in that cluster, right?
Well, like that sounds extremely user unfriendly from a UX standpoint, Mitch. Like brutally so.
So, I mean, there are 2 things. I mean, producer can control a lot of things, but I think the consumer, someone who calls the service, should have the ability to decide if it's local or if it's global. It's not unrealistic to say that, a global service requires very, very different code. You need to implement things very differently to deal with a global service. There are all kind of databases, all kind of things that assumptions that are different if in between a local and a global request. So this one having a distinction between local and global, I don't think it's a problem. What John had a very good point, and that's I think we forget about it, is secure naming. Our model is based on reading the pods and guessing what service accounts we should put in the trusted SAN. List of spiffy identities. I think we need to fix it. I mean, if we implement this, we need to have an ability to specify. Producer specifies identity, and we don't have to watch all the pods to guess the identity.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to dig into the implementation details. I think that an almost requirement of this is that we should really try to make this as opaque as possible between the clusters, such that I do not want a control plane in cluster A needing to watch pods in cluster B. That seems like a inherent thing that is prone to complexity that we should try to minimize and avoid.
But it's not implementation, it's API. I mean, we need the API to be able to reflect, hey, this is an exported service, and this is a SPIFFE identity that we, or whatever SANs that you need to verify, secure naming identity. It needs to be reflected in the API. We have it in some APIs, but
we should dig into the, I do want to see details around like what is necessary and what we might be able to do. And kind of like also how this changes with Ambient, because there's definitely some things that Ambient makes this easier where we're hitting a waypoint or something like that instead of having like client sidecars need to be as intelligent as they are currently.
the identity of the waypoint is as good as any. I mean, that's a good default. I think it's not. I don't have a problem with that.
Like it's a shorthand, right? Like it's a way to condense potentially multiple identities that back a service, but ultimately we'll still end up in situations where we could have more than one identity backing it.
And that requires API. That requires API multiple identities, not by magically writing pods. That's really.
Yeah, it's certainly not directly expressed in service import.
So just to try to understand, we're not sharing like public key information in advance. We're simply telling the client which names can authenticate for this service.
Yes.
Can be members of the service. Yes.
Okay.
Unless you use sorry, ACME, and you get a real DNS certificate, and then you don't have any problem.
So the core thing that, as far as I can tell, we really need MCS for is to represent a consistent IP address for a cluster set service. Because if you're running multiple SDODs, they can't be ephemeral, generated on the fly and held only in memory. They wouldn't agree on IP addresses, and we might be able to make something like that work, but I really don't want to. So what we have left is that we need this IP address to be stored within the service import. It's significant only for the scope of the cluster that it exists in. Everything else, in terms of like the identities that can back a service, can be held in memory by SDOD. I don't think we need to store that in the MCS API.
Mitch, why do you believe it must be stored in the service import instead of, for example, a service entry, which already implements auto-allocation, already has a field? We just need to change the implementation to be multi-cluster aware.
The primary reason for not using service entry is that we don't create service entries today. They're a human-driven API, and so we have the potential for conflict with service entries that have already been written in the cluster. Whereas service imports are not a human-driven API. No one should ever be hand-coding service imports. They're meant to be written automatically.
There are ways around it. I mean, we can use the name prefix, and service imports may be created by a different implementation. I don't think that's a real easy argument. And yeah, I mean, we are modifying service entries.
Like the controller pattern is pretty well established, right, for resolving that case, Mitch.
In terms of like owner information?
Yeah, if a service entry doesn't exist, create it, or if it exists, just populate like we do today. Especially if you want to bring your own name, service import doesn't have any capability to express a name. It's just assuming clusters are local. So if we agree with the first part, where you can bring your own name, you need service entry or something equivalent.
Right, like I can manually create service import and service export, right? Like there's nothing inherent in the machinery. Yeah. Right, that prevents creates that distinction, Mitch, right?
So I mean, multi-cluster service is, well, it is what it says it is. It is a multi-cluster service import. I don't know why we would hijack another API to represent a multi-cluster service when we already have one.
Not hijack. Service entry is the APIs that we use forever to express a name that is not clustered local, which has an IP, which may be provided by the user or auto-located. Both are valid cases. And that's what it was designed to do, to represent an entry that is not part of the Kubernetes service discovery.
But multi-cluster services are part of Kubernetes service discovery, right? We're using service discovery from another cluster to resolve that value. Like if you look at sidecar-based multi-cluster, we don't use service entry at all, as far as I understand it.
We do if you bring your own name. I mean, if you
We
want to,
do, yes. Because you use service entry to declare that global naming you want to use, right? So I guess my
maybe
question is, can you use service entry under the cover, even though if you don't want you exposed to your user?
That was my exact question, Lynn. Is like I'm trying to understand whether Cost is proposing it as an alternative to service import or an implementation detail.
Service entry is a first-class API. We support it. It's not a bad API. It's not a good API. It's not perfect, but it's more powerful and expresses more than service import. Service import lacks ability to express, bring your own name. I mean, if you use anything but cluster local, you're out of luck. You have no way to express it. So
Yeah.
I'm just saying, keep the V1 service entry, which we promise to support forever. It's already part of the code. We have auto location. We have everything in place. Why should we mix service import? Service import may be created hidden under the scene to conformance with with the spec, but users should look at service entry and have a service entry where this is reflected, because it's documented for us as a user visible. It has status, it has all the other stuff.
Yeah, service entry is what service import should be, but isn't, sadly. And service import is what it is because Kubernetes service is what it is. But right, there's also widespread recognition within the Kubernetes community that service is not great. Right?
Service entry is not great. Service entry is not great either.
I'm not saying it's great, but like service is bad.
Yeah. It's not as bad as service import.
It could be worse, but it is bad.
So given that there's
Istio could obviously support both, right? The question is, which one should we use to implement features? Like if somebody runs an MCS controller, fine. Right, but you mentioned earlier that Cilium is planning to implement an MCS controller. If I were to go and read the specification for what they have to do to make it work and make it work with network policy, right? Either they're going to not have end-to-end network policy, or they're going to have to propagate their synthetic Cilium IDs across cluster boundaries and either inline it into the service import or put it out of band in another API or another resource type to make it work.
So Cilium is doing something. Yeah, Cilium is doing something where they're actually they have users create service export, they populate the service imports automatically through the controller, and then the implementation detail is that service import is then actually creating a service under the covers as an implementation detail of how they're getting VIPs and stuff working.
Okay, but the network policy is no longer end-to-end, right?
Labels, IP, identity, yeah.
Right, so they're going to have to go and if people want network policy end-to-end in that world, because their use of synthetic IDs, which mutate, they have a synchronization problem. If they want to implement it, either they're trying to get around the synchronization problem or they're actually trying to implement it. They only have one of two choices. Neither are great, or neither is easy, right? Distributing the synthetic IDs is probably prohibitively hard. That was, I think, already the case when they had multi-cluster flat network not using MCS.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious, because I haven't heard any details on changing or doing anything new for the MCS implementation than is currently the case with how the multi-cluster cluster mesh stuff is working.
Right, so it's going to have a bunch of limitations. Yeah. So it's just another example, right, of where the MCS API is insufficient, right, to actually meet a policy requirement.
Well, I guess I don't view MCS as I view it primarily as a discovery API and a mesh is the place where you can layer other functionality like policy on top of that. I think that having an understanding and like support for policy is mostly out of scope for MCS. I do want to better understand if there are things that are gaps that would make sense to add to MCS that could enable better use of it by us. But I think that solving policy is not something that MCS intends to do on its own.
Right. So that any policy system needs MCS not to distribute just to distribute an IP. It needs to distribute metadata. Right. And that was excluded from the spec because nobody could agree what metadata to distribute.
Okay, so I mean, like, if there's a need for opaque metadata, that's something that I would definitely be interested in kind of like understanding the requirements that we would have there.
Like today, we distribute endpoint labels, right? So we can do that, right? That's what we do inside EDS, right? It's what we do inside the APIs. That's the requirement.
So given that we're over time, Louis, I'm wondering if maybe you or Costin or John could outline how you would see service accounts used to this end, because I'll say I don't quite understand it yet. So it'd be a little bit difficult for me to take the feedback and run with it at this point.
Like service endpoint would need to import, at the very minimum, per endpoint, the service account of the endpoint. Or
sorry, service endpoint is that?
No, the
Why
service
is that needed?
So you need to know the set of right. When you talk to an endpoint, there's two things. There's the controller that checks is that endpoint allowed to be a member of that service. And then at connection time, we check is the endpoint implementing the service account that it's supposed to implement.
So the question then is, why does that need to be stored in a CRD? Why does that not just live in memory in STOD?
So service import and endpoint slice exist as the runtime distribution mechanism. It's the only reason they are materialized. If the argument is they shouldn't be materialized because they're infrastructure, that argument also applies to MCS. Like, why does MCS need to materialize them?
So we need materialization for the multi-cluster IP address, right?
Yes, that's the only thing you need.
Yep.
In theory, right? But why does it materialize endpoint slice? Like, it's in the spec.
So the endpoint slice is based. So the relation of endpoint slice to MCS service import is not for it is not like directly populating anything from the pods on the exporting cluster, the like internal implementation details. It could do that in some implementations if that makes sense. For Ambient, the way that I see endpoint slice being used is for an importing cluster, a controller is creating a service import and it is creating an endpoint slice for each east-west gateway on an exporting cluster. So that's where the Z tunnel or whatever is dialing out from the cluster where it's imported is selecting an IP address from those endpoint slices, which is that gateway that has the like H-bone wrapping, and the gateway is responsible for forwarding it on within that cluster.
Right, but we already have that state, right? Like, because we have the materializing peer gateway already with that state. We don't need that. We don't need the IP.
Oh,
we just need to know that service is available at that east-west, and that east-west may have multiple IPs. Right, so we're materializing to fit into the API when we don't need to.
So then the east-west gateway would resolve the service by host name?
As described above, yes. If you're not distributing endpoint IPs and you're just distributing the east-west gateway, how else is it going to route?
Trying to think of how this works. So when Z tunnel acts as a client, it's not automatically setting hostname, correct?
Right, but we just in the doc, right, we've talked about fixing that.
So then we need an IP address that doesn't represent one east-west gateway, because you're not routing traffic to a particular cluster, but that represents the set of all east-west gateways. Yes?
Yes, so we have the materialized VIP for the logical service, right, in the consuming cluster. And that may be, that materialized VIP is the, depending on the use case, the logical union of all imported services plus the local service.
And,
Right,
and where
that's
do we
the purpose.
store that materialized VIP?
Right, that's either service entry, or I guess in Mike's proposal, in service import.
Okay.
If the service exists locally, right, and as we've said, cluster set.local versus .local and the load balancing decisions about which ones you address and namespace sameness, right, is an orthogonal concern. Very often it will just be on the service. Istiosemantic today. As
When you
John
say
mentioned
on
earlier,
service, the existing cluster local service, we would add information to it.
no, you just said we needed an IP, right, to represent that logical union.
Sure.
Right, and that IP needs to be stably allocated. Service performs that function. Right, like as John said, like having IP oscillation occur just because a remote cluster removed a service is not a great experience, right? Also having DNS oscillation occur because the remote cluster removed a service. Right, forcing an application to switch between .local and .clusterset.local is terrible. Right, that's just, right, that will break things. So we're going to make users choose between always addressing, right, .svc.local or .clusterset.local.
I thought we had already resolved that you could alias those in DNS and allow that to be a separate concern.
Right, but like you're also oscillating which resources becomes the stable allocator of the IP, right? And that introduces instability. So if I have a local service and I have a cluster set.local service, they have two different VIPs, right? The cluster set.local goes away. The VIP oscillates. Depending on what you have to define precedence rules. With the CNAME aliasing, if I said alias service.local to the cluster set.local, if I remove the cluster set.local, the VIP would oscillate. Not
Okay,
great.
I think I understand. I'm not entirely sure what to do about it, but I think I understand.
So in
I
general,
also understand what you're saying, but I guess I'm wondering, is this something that we expect to happen at a cluster in steady state?
not steady state, but like this transitional state could like cause a serious outage.
So basically, the scenario would be a multi-cluster service exists for this client. They're calling it, which means they're sometimes routing locally, sometimes routing remotely, just depending. Then all other clusters remove that service export or whatever control we're using for what services are exported, because the problem is not particular to MCS. So now effectively that client side cluster would have no reason to expose a multi-cluster VIP for the service. And then the DNS doesn't resolve anymore unless we have some sort of like fallback search set, which I would assume we have. But then again, if the client isn't leveraging fallback, what if the client is explicitly stating cluster set? Then fallback wouldn't, well, I don't know enough about DNS to say if we could fall back to cluster.local.
I mean, you
The same
could.
as you should fall back to cluster .local, I would expect.
Right, but also there are dumb clients that don't re-resolve, right?
So basically, you're wanting that VIP to persist whether or not other clusters have exposed the service.
I would want in general the resolution to give me the most stable VIP. The semantics of the VIP can change as fast as you want. The VIP itself should not change.
So as long as we control the process that allocates these IPs, that seems compatible with MCS. We don't remove the service import. If there's a local service, the only time we remove a service import is if there are literally no endpoints.
Right, but MCS is requiring the allocation of the VIP.
No, it is requiring a VIP to exist. It does not have to be a freshly allocated one. We could reflect the same VIP from a service that already exists in the cluster by that name on the service import.
Are there any semantics in the MCS API that allow or just
I think
it
I'm thinking
is
differently.
It
So
is
you guys
a
are talking
yeah.
about stable identification of IP addresses. That's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is simply not having a cleanup policy. Once we create a service import, we don't delete that service import. Even if all of the remote clusters no longer have that service exposed, we keep the VIP, we keep the service import object, so that you can resolve locally your cluster set.local. Now, if the service stops existing locally, that might be an occasion to delete the service import. We could talk about that scenario. I'm not certain about that. Because at that point, once it stops existing locally, you would say it exists nowhere. There's no valid backends for this service. There's no reason to continue resolving DNS. But as long as there's a valid backend, we keep the service import around.
Right. So I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying that like the MCS API does not talk about this type of stuff.
Correct.
Really.
It is a deliberately in many cases underspecified API that kind of lets us do what we need to with it within the just bare minimum constructs that exist for exporting and importing.
Okay, so two comments about that. One, that means that everybody's going to implement it different, right? So constant point is more reinforced than ever. And two, we need to validate it against the actual functional requirements we want to deliver. Right, so this is a great example of one, right? Churn. What, like stability versus churn. And there are very clear churn cases.
Okay, so I don't understand is there a proposal?
I could not hear Mitch. Was it just me?
You cut out.
You guys can hear me now?
Not really. Are you mowing the lawn, Mitch? So there's, the existing semantics of service entry. So just there's adopt the naming semantics of MCS without adopting the implementation. So runtime only, right? No materialization. That would be the potential counter proposal. Then there's materialize the infrastructure of MCS and document how we achieve stability against churn, right? Creation and deletion of remote service, creation and deletion of local service, and then name resolution semantics and priority ordering. John, did I miss anything?
Yeah, I'm still not sure how we get the actual information we need into the things.
Yeah, I guess there's also just metadata propagation, like can we actually get identities from the peers so that we can perform something like secure naming? We need to mimic the behavior of service entry.
All right. Let's try to get, I added a further consideration section. I would love if we can get these points, like basically the open to-dos of what do we want to talk about that we don't have solutions or descriptions for yet, and at least like get the problems to be solved into this doc.
Alan, nice to see you again, Alan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I guess to sort of echo something John and Louis said is, I think that the difference that sort of MCS gives you is it's this kind of service import isn't like a modifier on a service. It's kind of a separate abstraction. So if you're a user of services, you have to understand about services, and they have cluster IPs. Service imports, they have cluster set IPs. There's a way of mapping DNS onto it, but some clients, at least like in this sort of pure L4 ambient case, are just kind of, not sophisticated, and they just know about an IP address and stuff, or there's other objects in Kubernetes that can reference a service and do things. So I guess one kind of split in my mind is like whether there is this kind of separate concept there, or whether there's some way. It feels like the kind of older traditional Istio multi-cluster model is like you have a service and a cluster IP, and there's some way of modifying the semantics of that to make it sort of expand to endpoints across clusters somehow. Or but I know there's criticisms with that too, of like saying, it hijacks cluster local and makes it not be local anymore. So, but then the nice thing is, like, if you're a consumer of a service, you don't need to change or do things, and you talk to services the way you normally do, and it kind of just works. So yeah, I don't have any real other insights, just that it feels like there's some trade-offs there between the models.
Mike, should we go have an Istio community goes talks to the multi-cluster SIG about all this stuff to see? Because if there's not going to be consensus about like solving the problems that we just raised, right? Like, are we just going to run into too much friction? And MCS is just going to be what Alan just described, right? Which is a way to allocate a new service, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's never going to have any like real support for merge semantics. It's never really going to have support for these other more advanced things that we do. And we just might be beating our head against a wall.
I think what would be very useful first is to document what those requirements are. Because I think that from like the MCS side is just, there is not a lot of experience with using that API in production at scale and seeing some of these concerns. Like the VIP stability churn is just like, it's not there's opposition to it. It's an issue I have never heard discussed in that group.
Okay. That last statement makes me a little bit afraid.
I understand that could be concerning, but I think like step one is let's identify what our requirements are, and it's possibly worth talking in that group. It's also, I think, worth considering, like, are there things that we can build more robust that are not dependent on any kind of change upstream, or like identifying like where are gaps where we need a change versus we just need our machinery to be able to add an annotation to a service import or something like that.
I'm a little yes, like, but I'm a little afraid of like
yeah.
like spec expansion by annotation, right? And
I've seen the ingress problem. I am
yeah.
Yeah,
I know. We all know.
It's more of like, is that we have to because we have weird specific use cases, or we have a temporary solution that it is amenable to being expanded upstream. I basically want to better understand what our needs are. I think it's step one here.
Did the MCS folks ever run a user survey?
I know it was discussed at some time like 2 years ago. I don't recall if it actually ever happened.
Okay, because like one thing I absolutely want to do in the Istio community is ask them like what experience they want, right? Like Istio is already shipped like just same name, right? Like we don't do anything, we just merge everything.
Yep.
You know, anecdotally, I've heard that that's a requirement, right, from users because they don't want to change how their applications address. And I think it would be wrong of Istio to unilaterally get rid of that.
Yeah, it's something that I expect is convenient for many small scale users. I have seen it become so console had a similar model and basically redesigned their entire multi-cluster because it was a really big problem for larger organizations at scale where unpredictably you would be having cross-cluster traffic or like implicit dependencies on like databases in certain regions, things like that. It was something where moving towards a more granularly defined export, like service owner controls exporting and making their service discoverable in other clusters was a desirable property.
Well, that did require, right, still consumer control because they have to use different names to get different properties. Right, if a service is exported multiple ways, the consumer still chooses which one of the addressing modes to use.
Yes, both of these are like if you have the granular underpinning, then you can layer on UX to auto export everything or automatically route by like just the simple name like foo routes off cluster if you configure it such a way. Like you can make that UX nicer if you have the granular underpinnings. If you have the kind of like broad underpinnings where you export all and that's the only way you have it, and you import all and cluster.local sends everywhere, then you kind of lose the capability of having that more granular mode.
Sure, and I'm fine of offering people more. Yeah. Just if the MCS folks haven't surveyed users, that's kind of a miss. We should ask what semantics they want, and we should also ask them what semantics they want in the context of a more granular load balancing API. Like just saying this is the only way to get global, right? Like that's naive, right? That's not really the universe we live in, right? Like, are you okay having everything be global if you have load balancing controls that make you prefer local, right? And then so you're optimizing for cost first and then availability. Would you be happy with that model? Or is that like, are you happy with that model for the 90% case?
Yeah, I'm the conversations I've heard about that and been part of internally at Console is that model is great for a team, a like single small team that runs 3 clusters to expose their services, something like that, where they fully understand what everything is doing. It is a nightmare when you're having a like large multi-tenant cluster where each team has a namespace and suddenly all of their things are unpredictably routing across clusters. And that's what I've heard from console customers, which is not directly mapped to MCS API, but it was a design consideration where we saw the like granular export controls as preferable for users of a certain scale.
Is my audio working better?
Hey, that's a little better.
All right, I switched devices. So I think, Louis, like I totally agree with your concern that you need to be able to take a given client and have them migrate to a multi-cluster service dependency without changing their code or their application config, effectively using the same domain name resolution that they're already using today. We need a programmatic way to do that. I don't think that that's a concern for MCS in general, right? If you have DNS controls, you can say that your default search is no longer cluster.local, but is now clusterset.local. As a matter of fact, you can do that with pod DNS configs already today arbitrarily independent of what DNS, enterprise DNS you might or might not be using.
Unless you use a fully qualified domain name, and then that doesn't work.
That is true. So it's not a full hijack. It's more like a defaulting. I don't know that we
That was
want.
one thing that, like, that's one thing we did run into in the early versions of Istio, right? Was not everybody used short name resolution all the time. They still don't.
And that's still a thing that, like, if we pops us off the call, right? If we want to allow in Istio still doing that cluster.local hijack as like an opt-in configuration, I don't think that is the worst thing. It's making that not the default always on everywhere behavior.
Oh, like as we discussed earlier, like I want to create a naming API that would control for this. But like DNS, like search paths, like is not a way to achieve the level of control that users need. It's just an insufficient mechanism. That's all. I'm not objecting to say like merge.local, like have an API that says merge.local and cluster set.local, or don't merge them, right? And like tell people like you got to address them differently if they want to address them differently. That's fine. But we should also know like what the preferred default is going to be. Like there are lots of really large Istio users across diverse environments, totally reliant on namespace sameness, .local hijacking, and load balancing.
Yeah, and I'm fully aware of that, and I think that that is an opinionated default that we can choose in Istio. Like, yeah, like I know it's a thing that Costin doesn't want. I would prefer it to be off by default, but if we have a toggle to enable that for Istio users who are dependent on it, I don't hate that.
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at, okay, I'm using the dumb name, right? Let's just say cluster.local is the dumb name. I get whatever the default load balancing semantics are. 80% of the time I'm happy, right? Assuming you've got reasonable load balancing semantics turned on. Prefer local, right? Then there's a subset of services where you're like, that's crap. I can't afford that, right? I'm talking to my database. It's in another region. This is killing me on costs. So for that service, you want to do something different, right? And then we just like, you walk down the path for that service and say, well, like I can't even have prefer local. I have to have local only as my load balancing semantic. Maybe that's the next step that you take, right? So then I'm not allowed to fail over, right, across regions, right? I'm only allowed to fail over within zone. Still, I haven't changed the name, right? The load balancing semantics have changed. The naming hasn't changed. So the app didn't change.
Yep, and this is
or like
you can label the namespace of like hijack cluster local for this namespace or this pod or not pod service, whatever, like something like that. I have to drop, but yeah, I think there are ways that this is solvable within Istio that do not necessarily require changes to MCS.
I guess,
Well,
Louis, the question to you would be if we can, we can demonstrate, you know, short name control over short name resolution, as well as an install time parameter for continuing to hijack cluster.local. Does that resolve your concerns in this space, or is there? Because when you talk about having a naming API, I hear we need another 6 to 9 months to design this thing to make sure we've gotten all of the multi-cluster APIs right.
I don't know. Like, I don't think the naming API proposal would actually be that difficult. Like, we don't have to. Like, it just has to cover what we have today, and then let's just say like just what we have today plus cluster set.local. Right. Start with like those two things. Right. Like we could do other stuff later. Like, okay, I want to have a different suffix. I want to have a different mapping semantic. Right. Just be a little careful in the API design, but I don't think it would be that hard. And it can be admin only.
My experience of getting a new API through Istio is that it typically takes on the order of quarters to years. We're very hesitant about adding new CRDs. You can see the tag API proposal, which has been out there for 2 to 3 years now.
if I'm happy with admin only, I'm happy with mesh config to start with.
Okay. So we have mesh config settings that control that sort of defaulting between cluster set.local. I could totally get behind that. I was thinking more like a per namespace or per service CRD that can control for each individual service how they do resolution, and the complexity explodes pretty
Like at
quickly there.
a certain point, and like this is one of the gaps in MCS, right? There's no policy API that's like cluster wide.
Correct. Yeah, that's out of scope for MCS. Yes.
Right. In reality, what most people want is a policy API, right? Which is like, hey, these services with these labels should be multi-cluster services, and here's the pattern, right? And then service import and export is just an implementation detail that they never ever look at, right? Ever.
Sorry. I thought you were talking about authorization policy. Oh, for like export policy, I think that there is absolutely space that could be added to MCS if that is something that we like think is desirable and upstreamable. It's also something that we can do as a Istio design, and if we have the core primitives underneath, like we can decide later whether that makes sense to upstream rather than blocking on trying to wait for something to go through upstream.
Yeah, like that's what we would end up doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can logically design the API. Don't think it's that hard, really. We can see if like Istio is going to have a bit more semantic capability than Kubernetes does, right? Because of its load balancing control. Like Kubernetes has prefer local, right? And we have like regional and zonal, like arbitrary hierarchical based load balancing controls. So there might be a little bit of impedance mismatch between what could be upstreamed and what we would do, but at least logically they would align. Right, but that's the type of API that we would want. And I think that's the API that most users would want, because for that 10% case where you want just absolute fine-grained control, in Istio, use service entry. Just create it, right? You're unblocked completely. In Kubernetes, you're not unblocked, sadly. You can't really do it with service today. I guess you can, right? You can manually create endpoint slice, do service, and pray. But
okay, I think what I can do is I can add to the document that those particular requirements, Louis, that the defaulting in terms of hijacking cluster set.local for the cluster wide, and then also demonstrate the ability to have a particular application that's using short names be migrated from local to cluster set. I can sort of demonstrate both of those in, I don't know, maybe an appendix or something like that.
Yeah, you have to, like, in quotes, DNS is insufficient. DNS short name resolution is an insufficient semantic, sadly. Sucks, but it's true.
Okay, I don't quite understand, but maybe we can dig into that next week.
But it's just like if FQDNs are FQDNs, there's no aliasing. Once you've done that, you could do CNaming, but like CNaming doesn't really, like, Kubernetes doesn't have great CNaming APIs.
I guess I hear what you're saying. What I don't understand is what we would do about that. Are you wanting clients to stop using DNS?
No, clients will continue to use DNS as inconsistently as they always have. That's the problem that we have to live with. And saying that we're going to rely on DNS short name order resolution to address the problems, all of the problems, will not work. Like, if you want to continue
right,
using,
which is why we have the ability to hijack cluster.local as sort of the break class, right?
Yes. Hijacking it by IP, not by search path resolution.
Right. But between those two, that covers all the cases?
I think so.
Okay. I'll add those to the doc, and we can sort of go over them next week and explore whether that was a thorough solution or whether there's more work needed there.
But actually, what I'd like to focus on, in some ways, from a requirement standpoint, is like a proposal for the naming API, the semantics that we actually want, and then a user survey asking people what semantics they want. You don't have to commit to implementing the API. It wouldn't be hard to propose one.
I think I can
use it.
capture like what you and I have talked about here, but you have some expectations of this naming API that I'm not sure I understand well enough that I could run with in terms of creating a user survey, etc. If you wanted to run with those, I think that would be fantastic.
All right, let's chat offline about it. Well, we have a giant thread going, so we'll just chat there.
Sounds good.
Maybe I'll try to write something up.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it. Catch you guys next week.
Likewise. Thanks for talking, y'all.
All right. See you all.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.